if a government is trying to cover up secrets, as in lies and incompetence and so forth, that's not protected. Okay, as far as government secrets that can prevent somebody from publishing, that's going to be like, I don't know, nuclear launch codes or private information about certain people that would otherwise put them in a lot of danger. Does that make sense? So, if you're in the government, you need to do the right thing and make sure that stuff is available for people to report on. So, I wanted to talk very briefly about the Watergate case, because that was another one where there was stuff going on back in 1972, 73, 74, relative to President Nixon. And he wasn't real keen on the news coverage of it, particularly from the Washington Post. The Washington Post got wind that there was some connection between the White House, Nixon's White House, and a break-in at the Democratic National Headquarters, which were located at that time in the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C. Was there a connection? Turns out there was. Okay? How did Washington Post reporters find out about some connections? Well, they were doing their research and homework and asking all kinds of questions, but they also had a source. And this is really interesting. You can put this down. If you're a source for a newspaper, what do you think about that? If somebody's like, I want to say some stuff about like what's really going on in the government, but I don't want my name to be out there. Is that cool? Yeah, you're like, the news reporter that you're talking to knows who you are, but you don't want to go on record. Is that okay? Are you okay with that? Well, whether you are or not, it happens a lot in Washington, D.C. Okay? There's all kinds of people that release all kinds of information about what's going on in government. They're called leaks, these confidential sources. And sometimes, they're looking out for their own interests, and sometimes they're looking out for the best interests of the public. So, oh my gosh, it gets really, really interesting. As it turns out, there was one particular source that was very helpful for the Washington Post reporters, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, particularly Woodward. He had a confidential source that was referred to as Deep Throat. It's like, whatever. And he worked for the government, and he provided key bits of information and kind of set the news reporters on the right trail. And what did they ultimately discover? Massive cover-ups. Massive cover-ups in the White House that ultimately made their way all the way back up to the high positions in the White House and to the president himself. Yeah, so Nixon was probably going to, he was on the cusp of being impeached for the cover-up, not so much the break-in, but the cover-up. The Democrats the Democratic National Committee had a headquarters. They rented out some space in the Watergate Hotel. It was that's why they call it the Watergate scandal, because that's where the initial thing occurred. Although there were all kinds of other little things that were going on and so forth. But if you're the government or the White House, whatever, and you're putting a lot of money, time, and effort into covering up what's actually going on, that's what's going to get you in trouble. How many of you guys have ever gotten into more trouble for trying to lie or cover up about something bad you did than the initial bad thing that occurred, right? So, it's kind of like a truism. It's not so much the bad thing, it's the cover-up that occurred. That's why George Washington was really wise to always admit to chopping down cherry trees, I guess whenever that, or who knows if that probably wasn't true. So the heroes, it looks like, are the news media, and of course we'll play this one little clip for you, because way back, this is definitely old school movie trailer, All the President's Men, about the scandal, the Watergate cover-up, and the Washington Post effort to uncover it. Yeah, as far as movie trailers, this is definitely old school. They're putting all of the Oscar nominations and awards and so forth for the film that came out. Oh, there's the Watergate Hotel. Somebody broke in there. And the security guards caught him. Dustin Hoffman. I'm not here.
All the President's Men, the story of the two young reporters who cracked the Watergate conspiracy. Howard Hunt, please. Mr. Holt, did you know Howard Hunt?
Well, the White House said he was doing some investigative work.
Well, you said they stumbled into leads. No.
You got CIA and FBI.
And piece by piece, they solved the greatest detective story in American history.
There's no way the White House would control the investigation.
I don't understand.
You threatened if you tell the truth.
Don't you understand what you're
That's Deep Throat.
At times, it looked as if it might cost them their jobs.
You guys heard about the story that said the former Attorney General, the highest ranking law enforcement officer in this country, is a crook.
Their reputations. Why is the whole trying to do it? I don't know. Perhaps even their lives.
Deep Throat says our lives may be in danger. Did their reporting help to break the case? Yes, and there were some folks in the government that were obviously following up on it. Congress was investigating. The Justice Department ultimately investigated. They were asking a variety of different key questions as to what was going on. And of course, when they're having these hearings and people are answering, I remember there was this one particular hearing where they were talking about how they kept recordings in the White House. Nixon had his office, the Oval Office, bugged, as actually did Johnson and Kennedy before him, presidents that had listening devices in their own office. And they knew about it. But did everyone else who was in the office? No. Nixon was using it for, a variety of purposes. I know, for example, maybe following the precedent of Kennedy, Kennedy had it because he wanted to sort of like have those to listen back to, to help formulate his ideas when he's writing his memoirs and so forth. But it was fascinating because when Nixon put him in there, he had no intention of anybody else having access to him except for just himself. Well, the court ordered that those tapes be handed over. Oh, Nixon fought it in the courts and so forth, and the United States Supreme Court ultimately said those are property of the United States government. And so they got handed over. And there was some pretty incriminating stuff, although there was one critical gap on one of the recordings that took place in a conversation in the White House around the Watergate tape, or around the Watergate investigation, and so there was a question as to the gap. But for a lot of people, it was like, whoa, that's the smoking gun. That's really, really critical evidence moving forward. So guess how many presidents here in the bottom row after Richard Nixon also continued the habit, the practice of recording conversations in the White House? None of them. None of them. Because, as you see, they can be subject to subpoena. Subpoena is an order from the court to hand something over, whether it's a document or a recording or whatnot. Very, very interesting, because if those things get handed over, So, yeah, that's why it was always fascinating. During the Trump administration, you'd hear these various different people going, well, I'm keeping a recording of what's going on, and I'm keeping a recording of what's going on. Trump's position officially was, let's not have any recordings. Of course, if you're a top government official, whether it's a recording or an email, who do those belong to? They belong to the government. So, yeah, this is where Secretary of State Hillary Clinton got into some controversy and so forth. She was President Obama's first Secretary of State, and she kept a separate email system that she was in charge of, as she would say, because that's like private records and, a lot of emails to her daughter and so forth. Other people are like, no, you're a government official and those should be subject to Yeah, so it's like, who is in control of that? Well, yeah, a very interesting question. Curiously enough, Hillary Clinton, as a young attorney in the 1970s, worked on the Watergate case. So she was very aware of how communication, if you don't want it to be handed over, if it's part of government, it's going to be ultimately subject to the court looking at it, Congress looking at it, all kinds of various different folks looking at it, right? So, yeah. What kind of control do you have over the communications you're involved in? I wonder. Yeah, I mean, if you're working for the government, you don't have that much control over it. If it's a private situation, you just tell Alexa or whatever listening devices that are in your home to not save all the conversations that you're having. Yeah, good luck with that. Okay? So, interesting stuff here. By the way, who was the source? Bob Woodward, the newspaper reporter, played by Robert Redford, would not reveal who his source was. They had an agreement. They were like, until the guy dies, I'm not going to reveal who the source is. Well, just before the guy died, he allowed that Bob Woodward could reveal his name. And this wasn't that long ago. Turns out he was working in the FBI. So this is an FBI agent who was aware of what's going on and gave Bob Woodward some very key information. Here's his name, Mark Felt. It turns out he was an Idahoan working in the United States government. I didn't know. Yeah, so I mean, it was interesting. Yeah, he was the main source, the background source that provided critical assistance to the Washington Post reporters. Okay? Yeah, it's very interesting. Okay, next one. It's contained in the First Amendment, right, after free speech and free press. It's the right to petition, okay? And we're going to dispense with this fairly quickly because it's kind of like, yeah, you have a right to petition. You have a right to tell the government to do something. Is anybody having a problem with that? Does the government have to do it? What potential consequences does the government officials face if they don't do what you tell them to do? Yeah, they might be voted out of office if they're an elected official. I mean, that's how democracy works, right? So you have the right to send those in, and yeah, I mean, it's interesting, but there's nothing too critical or complex that we're going to spend a lot of time on that specific right to petition, because it's fairly limited. You've got the right to an opinion. You can tell the government what you think they ought to do, but as far as like a range of choices, there's a huge range of choices, and they don't always have to necessarily follow you. So here we go. Let's get into this one. There's all kinds of images here. You know it's going to be controversial, and in fact, if you were prepared coming in here for the quiz, you know about this case in Skokie, Illinois, involving some neo-Nazis. All right? Yeah. So let's get to this. There's two component parts to peaceful assembly / peaceful association. The word that is used in the Constitution is peaceful assembly, but there's some other ramifications that we're going to get to that people a lot of times are like, really? Is that what they're talking about? Wow, I had no idea. Let's start with the most obvious one. And this is really important because as they wrap up the proceedings in Minnesota, after the jury trial of Officer Chauvin in Minneapolis, the guy who was associated with his charge basically with the death of George Floyd. I always get the first part wrong because I don't want to say Pink Floyd. George Floyd. Yeah, Pink Floyd's like my generation going all the way back. Yeah, it is. It's very good music. Yeah. So, yeah. So here's the deal. If you have an opinion about what's going on in the world, can you get together with other people and express that opinion? Can you assemble for purposes of expressing your point of view? Yes. Now, obviously, you can write this down. Where are those rights going to be greatest? On public property or private property? Public property. If it's your own private property, yeah. Good point, yeah. If it's your own private property, for sure. But if you go onto somebody else's private property, they could say, get out of here. Which is why it's always fascinating, because do people protest in front of private residences? Yeah, I would say it's kind of disconcerting, and it's happened. Unfortunately, it's happening a little bit way too often. in this time and age, and it's from all quarters. In fact, if you haven't heard of this word, doxing. Yes, doxing. Putting the name and address of somebody who is potentially a government employee and so forth, so that people can protest outside their home. Now, officially, they're not supposed to go on their property, but they can be right outside the home, and it could create all kinds of interesting situations. Yes. Okay. Yes. So, and by the way, when I made a video in here the other day, when I walked around here, some of you guys may have noticed. In fact, you guys were very kind enough to point out that I doxed myself when I showed my driver's license. Remember that? And so when I recorded that, I got some help from the technical assistant, my wife, who managed to figure out how to blur that part out. So that is blurred out. So I don't have critical information. I mean, it's like, yeah. No, I know. It's fascinating because like the capture image is like this blurry image. So if you go back and watch that one, it's like, there it is. Yeah. So you've got more rights on public property. But here's an interesting one. Do you have more rights for peaceful assembly on public sidewalks as far as walking or walking in public streets? Yeah. Don't walk in roads? Why not? Because of cars? What do cars do on roads? They drive. Are they bigger than people? Are they faster? What typically happens? Who benefits usually in a contact situation between a car and a pedestrian? Well, this is actually a controversial thing because if you want to have a protest, and this is actually a good transition into this case in Skokie, Illinois. If you want to have a protest and it's going to involve a lot of people, maybe like a sidewalk isn't going to be enough, even if they have sidewalks. Maybe you want to have it on the road. And so what do? Write this down. You get a permit. You apply for a permit. This is a very, very important thing. You apply for a permit. All kinds of people apply for permits to use a public street for a variety of purposes. Temporary, typically, is a temporary thing. I'll give you an example. Here's a sort of an innocuous one. You guys like cycling? Cycling really fast, right? So they have sometimes like downtown in Boise, they'll cordon off some streets for a period of time for like a race, cycling race, or a running race, or a triathlon, or something like that. So it doesn't have to necessarily be public, but they apply for the permits and then have things cordoned off so that people know that, you can go do that. Can you just sort of like take a city block and like make it off limits just for yourself and set up like a little, public peaceful assembly zone? No. Sometimes, some of those things have been happening in recent times. This is where some of the controversy occurs. Key thing, write this down. If you want the right to peaceful assembly, one, it does need to be peaceful. Okay? If you want it on public property, you may be required, under circumstances, to get a permit. Kind of varies, right? So, if you're out in a public park and you're like gathering with some of your friends and doing it and so forth, that might be fine. Although, let's say you're hanging out at Julia Davis or Ann Morrison Park or whatever. Is there a certain period at which the law enforcement can go, yeah, you got to go now? Nighttime, yeah. So a lot of times that's a pretty regular thing. What if you're like, I got my First Amendment peaceful assembly right here? Yeah, so much for your nighttime curfew. I don't know, how's that going to weigh out? Probably, if you wanted to have a protest, you would probably still need that permit. It gets interesting, it gets controversial, and I would say over the last several years, sometimes folks aren't necessarily going for the permit, whether it's a parade or protest or whatever. They're just sort of going, okay, let's see if the police or law enforcement or the government is interested in actually removing us from this particular location. Yeah.
So, does the sidewalk in front of your house count as your property?
Generally, the answer, as I understand it, is no. Okay? That's like sort of an extension from the street. Yeah.
My dad used to walk past this house on the way to school and he would buy it. And if he stepped
Yeah, anyway.
Yeah, like, the sidewalk, like, it was her sidewalk.
It's fascinating because when you've got like a sidewalk in front of your home, a lot of the responsibility you might think would be upon you to make sure that the sidewalk's all cool and everything. But a lot of times that is going to be part of the public area. Now, what if it's a private neighborhood? The private neighborhood owns the roads and the sidewalks, right? In cooperation with the other people who are homeowners within that private neighborhood. Do you understand the difference? Okay, so those are very, very important distinctions.
What about like the grassy areas in front of, like, the houses, like, in between the driveways? No, in between the driveways, like, not the yard, but like, here's the yard, here's the sidewalk, here's a little extra little grassy.
And the other side of that is the road? Interesting question. You have to look and see. I mean, maybe that, in some situations, maybe that lady is right. Maybe on some of the sidewalk it is on your own property. But a lot of times that, plus maybe there's a little bit of grass there too, is part of the public. Although, yeah, good luck trying to beg off and have somebody else be responsible for for cutting the grass there. I know I gave my brother a hard time. My brother Jim's on the Ada County Highway District, and we had Snowmageddon. Remember Snowmageddon, where there was so much snow? I was joking about sending him a bill for like shoveling off the street in front of my house because there was not too many vehicles coming around to remove the thing, and I wanted to make sure that all that snow was gone. So I was like, I cleared the street as well as my driveway and the sidewalk, yada yada yada. Okay. So the key thing here is it's got to be for a peaceful purpose, and there is some government regulation that's allowable. Make a little note of this. We're not going to spend near as much time as I'd like to talking about the particulars of the civil rights movement, but just make a note of this. In the 1960s, one of the things that Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights activists liked to do is to have protests. They wanted to march peacefully on public road or public street or public sidewalks, And a lot of times the local law enforcement would just arrest them for no good reason. Or they would apply for a permit. For example, they wanted to walk along either side of a state highway between the town of Selma, Alabama, to the capital city of Montgomery. It was going to be a several-day journey, and they wanted to have a permit to do that. Well, can a government say to themselves, we don't like the nature of your protest, we don't like what you're protesting about, and so therefore we're not going to give you the permit? No, not necessarily. So the courts will look very carefully and see if it's seeming like it's going to take away your right to speak out, your right to assemble because they disagree with it. That's not okay. In fact, you can write this down. Disagreeable speech, politically unpopular speech, is still protected as much as popular speech. Do you understand that? That's a key component of the Constitution. You may not like what somebody is about to say, and you guys are going to have to battle for this as we go forward in life, because sometimes people will go, oh, you're hurting me, your speech is hurting me. It's almost like, Salem witch trials or something. Oh, you're hurting me, you're looking at me funny. Please. It's like, America, get over it. In your lifetime, there's going to be all kinds of opinion that's really stupid, controversial, not well supported, irritating, yada, yada, yada. But can you just cut it down? No. And that was those victories that the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King Jr., got in the 1960s. Was King ultimately allowed to march from Selma to Montgomery over several days? Yes. Yes. Yeah, although it was tough because initially they were marching on the sidewalks and so forth, and they got beat up. Okay? And that was televised on national airwaves, and then President Johnson was like, yeah, that's got to stop. The Justice Department under Johnson was like, yeah, that's got to stop. And ultimately, the U.S. District Court in that region said, yeah, we're going to go ahead and give you that permit. And then President Johnson also said, oh, by the way, you know who's going to make sure to provide protection for the marchers so that something bad don't happen to them? We're going to federalize the National Guard of Alabama, so you guys are going to be providing some protection for those marchers. Okay? Wait, what? Yeah, no, it is. It's, yeah. Yeah, the people who sometimes might otherwise not be interested in like the nature of these marches and so forth, it can get very complicated. That's why some of the marches that are taking place over the last year or so get problematic on peaceful assembly. Do you have a right to go in the middle of a street and protest during regular, if you have a permit? If you don't have a permit, then no. And that's where things get really complicated, because if you're the government, you're like, what kinds of bad things could happen if you've got people in the street and you have vehicles also in the street? Yeah, I mean, you could get like people getting driven over and so forth. In fact, it was like one state, I'm trying to remember which state it was, Florida maybe, I can't remember. One state is like passing a law that gives immunity to drivers who could be sued by somebody who is in a street for the purpose of, like, I don't know, what purpose would you be in a street other than, you know. Yeah, well, that's the thing. Protected peaceful assembly comes in various different packages. We're going to get to the details of the neo-Nazi march in Skokie to understand exactly how wide that can go. Question here and then there. It gets messy. I mean, it's interesting because one of my reaction, because I mean, I've been watching these things all over the place. When stuff was happening with the protest after George Floyd died and so forth this summer, and there was protests all over the place, I'm like, okay, cool, peaceful assembly, protests, and so forth. I really didn't like it, and in fact, I actually felt it was counterproductive to the purposes behind a lot of those protests when the protests became not so peaceful assembly. Or other people, and that's where you really have to watch out for, because sometimes, you know, you're marching along with all your buds and your protests and so forth, and you're like, who are these guys, you know? Who could all of a sudden join your protest and turn it 180 and really ruin what you're trying to accomplish there? That's one of the things that, like, Martin Luther King Jr. was really, really focused on, because the first time when they were marching from Selma, they got beat up by local police, state police. Some of them were like, let's go get guns and shoot these guys. And the leaders were like, settle down, settle down, settle down. You want the dynamics, you want the message to be positive, 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 because you're looking to build an alliance of people who can ultimately make change, like getting the Voting Rights Act done in 1965, the Civil Rights Act in 1964. So that's why it's been a bit problematic, because when you have people marching out into the streets and so forth, causing traffic issues and so forth, it doesn't necessarily, I don't know. It's problematic. I mean, it definitely could negatively impact the message you're trying to get across, which is, you know, this guy died because of improper police conduct, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? But there's a real debate going along within different movements as to what is the best way to get your assembly and your speech out there. Because some folks, hello, American history. How did the protesters in Boston, did they do peaceful assembly? Did they protect private property? Plunk, plunk, plunk went all of the tea off of the ships. That was I mean, you can, that's peaceful, but I mean, you destroyed property. So, I mean, it's very interesting, because some folks will say the best way to get your point across is the five-finger approach. You curl them all up and then you make a fist. Why are we asking that question? I don't know. That's nasty. Yeah. Yeah, that's nasty. So, needless to say, what is protected in the Constitution? What kind of assembly? Violent protest assembly? No. Peaceful assembly? Yes. Okay, MK, I was going to call on you. Yes. What? Yes, 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 of course. Yes. Okay, let's get to our first case. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, write down the Skokie case. This will be on your test. Okay? The Skokie, Illinois case. I don't believe it had to go all the way to the Supreme Court. Okay? We'll get to it. Hold on. Yeah, if you read the material, you know the answer. Shh. Okay, here we go. Here we go. Yeah, this is like bad facts that make some really interesting situation here. So you got some people with some really outrageous ideas. Let's call them neo-Nazis. They're like new Nazis. Then they think that white people are superior, Aryans are superior, yada, 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 kind of like Hitler. All right, so they wanted to have a march with a parade permit, a peaceful march set up during a particular time in a community, public roads and so forth. They wanted to get a parade permit from Skokie, Skokie, Illinois. I mean, of all places, Skokie, Illinois. Raise your hand if you can identify why did this particular group right here, why were they so keen in protesting Skokie? Yeah. There's a large Jewish neighborhood. So this seems very, very confrontational in the sense that they're saying, wow, we're taking upon our mantle a symbol and an identity that not only is anti-Jewish, but actually killed lots of Jews during the Holocaust, right? Was the government of Skokie really interested? Actually, let me just throw this out to you. On a quick thing, how many of you guys would be like, yeah, give them the parade permit? How many of you guys would be like, no, I think I'd rather deny the parade permit? Okay, so hands down on this one. It is interesting because if you did sort of an impromptu thing, just some people walking along the sidewalks, could they do that? Yeah, as long as you're not violating other people's right to move, okay? And this group, I don't know that they're very big, but they wanted, they didn't want to do a sidewalk march. They wanted the street, okay? The city was saying to them, this is an interesting thing, because is your right to peaceful assembly absolute as far as time and place and all this particulars? Do you, as the one who wants to do the march, get to determine all the different things? No. I mean, could you say, we want to have a march that goes on for 7 days, so we want to take over all the roads in Skokie, Illinois? No. The courts are going to look at this and go, reasonableness. Now, this is where things get interesting. How do you guys feel about this? Saying no to Skokie, Illinois, but you can march on another street in another community where, there's not going to be lots of Jews living, including Holocaust survivors were living in Skokie, Illinois. Okay, so among the older population, you had people that actually survived the Holocaust. The last thing that they wanted to do was see a whole bunch of neo-Nazis marching up and down their street. How many of you guys would be like, that seems a reasonable thing. You can have your march, but we're going to let you go somewhere else. Okay? And in fact, maybe they could have decided to do that. Ultimately, the court, and I don't think this went all the way up to Supreme Court, the district court ultimately overruled the city of Skokie and said they can have the march. Got that? They can have the march in Skokie, Illinois, in the Jewish neighborhood. So I imagine a lot of the Jews who were there who were not too keen about it, they're like, I think I'm going to go visit my cousin, in a few communities down the way. Okay? So, write it down. The neo-Nazis got a chance to march in Skokie at a particular time and place, but not, big, long thing. Have we had to deal with that in Idaho? Heck yeah. Northern Idaho, for a while, there was an Aryan Nations community just north of Coeur d'Alene. Reverend Richard Butler owned some property up there, and all kinds of neo-Nazis and Aryan Nation types and so forth would come up there. And they would regularly have protests in Coeur d'Alene. It was always interesting because for a while, I can remember this in my career, people would think of Idaho for potatoes, still do sort of. Now it's the blue football field at Bronco Stadium, and neo-Nazis. And they're like, really? That's up in northern Idaho. So Coeur d'Alene, the people of Coeur d'Alene, they actually organized and put on counter-protests. It was very fascinating. I always liked how they did this. They didn't want to get into these big, huge, massive shouting matches because do you think by yelling at a bunch of neo-Nazis you're going to be able to persuade them to take alternative viewpoints? No. Probably not. So what they did, they wanted to show people, at least people in their community and anybody else who's watching, that they did not like this sort of thing. So they would show up at these parade permit for these Aryan Nation, white supremacist type things. And the white supremacists would be marching down the street and so forth. There may be a dozen or two or so. And then you'd have 3 or 4 or 5 times as many counter-protests. And what they would do is they would turn their backs on them. Okay, they wouldn't yell at them and so forth. They would basically like turn their backs on them to basically say, and they had their messages and so forth, Idaho is not for hate, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? Let me finish out and then we'll call on you. Is there still an Aryan Nations compound for Reverend Butler up there in northern Idaho? No. It was an interesting thing that happened because here's a little piece of law. If you own property and you have a dangerous dog on your property, is there any obligation that you have under liability law as to the care and maintenance of that dog? What is that? You put a leash on your dog because otherwise the dog might run off your property and cause harm to somebody else. And then who's responsible for that harm? You are, because you have failed your duty to people who are nearby to protect them against an obvious risk of dangerous dog. Well, here's what happened in northern Idaho. There was a woman and her son. I want to say they were, I don't think they were white. I think they were like maybe Latino or something. Anyway, they were driving a vehicle and the car broke down. Like right near, they didn't realize it, but right near Reverend Butler's property, right? Which he had a whole compound up there and you had various different people from other parts of the country, Aryan Nations, neo-Nazis and so forth. They were hanging out on that property because they're like, hey, it's like the Reverend welcomes us, even if many of the people in Coeur d'Alene didn't. Anyway, they were working on the car, and it backfired. Okay? Well, apparently, some of the folks at the compound thought that that backfire noise was like an assault, a violent firearms assault. And so they descended upon this woman and her son and proceeded to beat him up. Okay? So that was bad. So guess what the woman and the son did? They sued. They sued who? The Reverend, the owner of the property, for not using due care to make sure that the people who were on his property were safe and kind and neighborly and didn't beat up other people in the neighborhood. It went to the court, ruling in favor of the plaintiffs. They won a massive award for money, and guess how Reverend Butler had to pay it off? He had to sell the place. And it was purchased by a human rights organization in northern Idaho, and they turned the whole thing, they turned the whole thing into a human rights like education center and so forth. These guys, Wasmuth is one of the guys who was, he was like a Catholic priest.
What's his name? The guy from the Confederate, they planted all the burials there. Thank you.
Yeah. So anyway, the interesting thing is Wasmuth is what is tied in with respect to the Anne Frank Human Rights Memorial here in Boise, because they helped to fund that and get that going and so forth as well here in Boise. Okay, so interesting thing. Let me do that one and then here.
Okay, so can they decide, can the court or whoever approves
The permits?
the decide the date?
Yes, those are relevant questions too.
So could they just, if they really didn't want to happen, just like force them to do it in 2 years?
Well, here's the thing. You have to be careful about it, because if you say, oh, not today, not this week, 5 years from now, would that be a violation of the First Amendment, freedom of assembly? Yeah. I mean, it's like, because that's an obvious thing to just like kick it all the way down the road so that it takes away their right. I think big enough to warrant a verdict and a jury amount that ended up forcing the place to be sold. So, yeah. I mean, you can still go up to there, but you have to, stay in local motel or Airbnb or whatever like that. Okay? So, peaceful assembly and association. Get your permit. Don't be a jerk. Make sure that you are respectful of the people around you. Okay? Yeah. Unfortunately, what happens nowadays, and this is where it kind of cheeses me off, because I like that Coeur d'Alene where people who had a different point of view just turn their face. Nowadays in some communities, I want to say Portland, unfortunately, you get extremists on one side, and then the other side's like, time to show up, or vice versa. And you get these guys out there, and they want to brawl. And it's really annoying, especially if you're a business nearby, because their brawl sometimes spills over into broken windows and so forth of the businesses nearby. And they look upon who to provide security so that the businesses are not going to be destroyed. the local police. And so then it's incumbent upon the police to arrest. And then, of course, if they make an arrest, what do you have to do after an arrest? You have to have a prosecution. You have to charge and leave it up to the jury to decide, what's going to happen there. Very problematic, okay? These are real issues that are going on, and it makes me somewhat concerned. Protests, okay? We got some interesting things with respect to protests. One of the things, PETA, you can write this down, PETA, P-E-T-A, PETA, P-E-T-A. Do you guys know what PETA stands for? No! Oh, my goodness. You obviously, do you know the real, I would say, the one that PETA actually has? People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, right? And it's interesting because PETA, like their opinions or not, I talk about PETA because they're very creative, okay? Agree with them or disagree with them and they have a whole wide range of issues having to do with animals, okay? But as far as peaceful assembly, they are totally into very creative methods of protesting. Raise your hand if you can tell me, why would they want to be so creative in their methods of peaceful protesting? Yes.
If you see something kind of weird on the street, you're gonna wonder what it is.
Now, if you're walking along the street and so forth, you're like, okay, I happen to see that on the street, I'm going to stop and watch and so forth and so on. Does PETA protest just for the attention of the people that happen to be walking by? I'll make it real clear to you. In Boise, Idaho, a PETA protester showed up in front of the Capitol building, and that's where a lot of protesters go. They come out, traditional protest, you go in front of the Capitol building, you got your signs, and you got a microphone, and if you got a lot of people, awesome. If you don't have as many people, you still do your protest. Here is one of the PETA protesters protesting. I think the particular thing there was they were protesting animals in zoos and circuses. I think it was a circus was coming into town, and they were like, that's not a very cool thing to do with animals, to put them in circuses. Why is she dressed like a tiger? Because tigers are in circuses. She's behind like a cage sort of thing. I know it's kind of like a garden fence or whatever. Why is she doing that? She's protesting, but why isn't she just like wear what she normally wears and hold up a sign that says, that's really terrible, circuses are bad? What kind of attention are they looking for? From who? Thank you very much. Write this down. News media. The news media. The news media covers these sorts of things, but they don't cover everything. And in fact, they only have so much time on a local news media broadcast when you get past local sports, weather, which they go on and on and on and on and on. Even if the weather is normal, it's kind of like we're going to talk for a lot about the normal weather, right? And so, is this more likely to gather attention? Why? Because she looks practically like she's not wearing nothing except for her leopard tiger skin thing. Sexualized protests and so forth, is that going to get attention? Yeah, it's always interesting because if you're local news media, it's like they have to make the decision. PETA is like, how far are they going to do it? Could they actually do something that would actually get them banned and arrested instead of being on the local news? Although if they got banned and arrested, where would they be? On the local news, right? Because I think there was a subsequent one where they actually had, and I still didn't get the connection, they had two people rolling around like they were in an intimate embrace. They were clothed, but they were like rolling around, and I didn't quite get the connection with the protests, but it got covered because the news media reporters are like, that's interesting, and by the way, PETA's protesting, yada, 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 okay? Okay. So sometimes, put this down, sometimes protesters want to get arrested, because if you get arrested, you're willing to get arrested, you may get more news media attention to your cause. Martin Luther King Jr. would get himself and his fellows arrested because some of the times what they were doing is they were violating or they were marching on public sidewalks with the First Amendment on their side, but local law enforcement was like beating down on them. And then they always wanted to make sure that there was news media coverage, because if you got a bunch of young people marching through the streets of Birmingham, Alabama, and the local law enforcement doesn't like it very much, and they bring out fire hoses and attack dogs, is that going to get on the news media? You have to, in a sense, be willing to face off with those. And ultimately, that helped turn the tide, and American public opinion, particularly in the North and the Midwest and the West, was like, whoa, what is going on in the Deep South? This is totally wrong. And they started to come over and support Martin Luther King Jr.'s objectives as far as like voting rights and civil rights and so forth. Here's sometimes what people will do. Write this down. And I believe this is a PETA one as well. Maybe PETA or another group that doesn't like fur. So you might get, and sometimes they recruited like well-known people, because the more well-known you are, the more likely it is that news media will cover you. So let's say you've got a well-known person, and they're really angry about fur. Okay? Animals being raised for the purposes of being killed and taking off their things, and not eaten, but their fur, so they make lovely fur coats. Raise your hand. How would a particular PETA protest give you two clues? Get a lot of media attention, and the person who behaves for PETA is willing to get themselves arrested. Now say that, what? Oh my gosh, that's terrible. Cut their own skin off and make an own jacket out of it? That's going a little bit too far. That would get attention. I was thinking of a little bit milder. Ugh. Yeah, that's terrible. Okay. How about, do you guys need any help? So let's say I need a volunteer. Who's going to be my fur-wearing person? Here's my fur-wearing person. All right? Okay, you stay right where you are. He's his fur-wearing person. Just stay right where you are. I'm a famous celebrity PETA protester, and I've got a can of red paint.
Oh, blood, yeah.
Right, so it looks like blood, it looks like bad, shame on you, and so forth and so on. How many of you guys feel like that was an effective protest that is going to get on the news? Is it going to get on the news? Effective as in it's going to get on the news. Okay? Are you more likely to support my point of view if I destroy your fur coat?
No.
How many guys are feeling bad for the fur like, Bambi's mom wearer, So thank you very much for participating in that. I tell you what, one thing you can be sure of is that people who have points of view to make in the political arena are constantly going to be looking for ways to get attention. Okay? That is going to take place. Shh. If you violate certain laws and so forth, and you go beyond the peaceful assembly part, then you're going to be in trouble. All right? The next one. It's very controversial. I got a story to tell you about this. Okay? All right. This is very interesting because, in fact, a lot of people who identify themselves as Christians do not like what Fred Phelps's church was up to. Here's some basic facts. Are you ready? Fred Phelps is no longer alive. He lived in Kansas, and a little church, and actually mostly it wasn't so much of a church as it was his family and then some people who agreed with him, and they had some very, very strongly felt points of view. Okay? Strongly felt points of view. Okay? Strongly Phelps. And they also had amazing, weatherproof, bright, easy to read signs that they took with them on protests all over the country. Got this? So they would protest all over the country in public places, expressing their point of view, which was, as I say, very strongly held, and from the perspective of people who call themselves, Christians and so forth, there were a lot of Christians who felt like they either didn't agree with all or part of what they were saying, or they certainly didn't agree with the manner in which the Fred Phelps folks were conducting themselves. For example, their basic premise is that this country is falling apart, it is just godless, and it is evil, and terrible things are going on in the country, particularly because of decisions that the country has made with respect to homosexuality, among others. Okay? And therefore, because there was greater acceptance of homosexuality than there had been in the past, that tainted the entire United States government. Do you follow? If the entire United States government is tainted and the country is tainted, therefore, bad things happening to people are entirely explained as in God is causing bad things, like 9/11. Here we go. Planes crash, God laughs, as in that is a warranted bad thing to happen to the United States because this country harbors evil ideas. Okay? Right? And they're not subtle about this at all. Right? They like to use fags a lot in their protest signs and everything like that. Okay? And they want attention. So here is what they have been doing, and see if you can think. Because I got a video here for you. Think, how do you handle this situation? They've got a First Amendment right to peaceful assembly. They can go in public places to expound their points of view. They had been, I don't know if they're still doing this, but they were several years ago, showing up at military funerals. So men and women who died in the service of their country in Iraq or Afghanistan or what have you, there would be a military funeral for that person, and their family and other people in the community would come out for that funeral, and the Fred Phelps folks would show up with their signs and loud expressions and all those kinds of things. All right? Think creatively. How many of you guys are like sympathetic to the family of the person who was having a funeral for them? That's a big duh. Ivan, you're not? Okay, so it's okay. He's like, I was writing something down. So, raise your hand if you can come up with, like, how do you deal with that? It's a free country. They got a right to protest and so forth. How do you deal with that? Victoria? So you're doing like a counter-protest kind of thing? Now, are you going to get into a fight? Are you going to go no fighting? Shh, I'll let Victoria finish. Shh, shh. Don't veto Victoria. She's got the floor. Victoria, what was your ideas? I can't fight. That's right. I can't fight. Yes.
I put a rainbow flag on a spear.
A spear? Okay. How many of you guys want to join the proud spear chucker people over here? Okay. Yeah. It's like using a symbol of freedom. Okay. Anybody else? As far as like, so you're going to like try and create like a visual kind of like distraction? Okay, how about, okay, all right, fair enough. That's a good starting point. Anybody have any idea as far as like the sound? Because they're going to be shouting. They've got their voices and they've got other kinds of aids. Yes? We are the champions. There we go. What kind of music? Now, this is a military funeral, so, I mean, what would be appropriate? Okay, well, they are, because funerals, typically, all right, let me interject here. So a lot of times then, the services, or at least part of the services, are at the graveside. So you've got like, public gravesite and so forth. Take a look here and see what you think of this. This is America. This is America. This is how Americans creatively think, right? We don't have to shut down and cancel all kinds of different voices out there and so forth. You can just sort of like be creative and figure out how to handle this, all right? This is a story that I found, and I think it's still apt. A biker group of veterans, including a pastor, shows up to counter-protests. I'll let the story play. Here we go. The Westboro Baptist Church. That was what Fred Phelps' group was called. Westboro Baptist Church, which is in Westboro, but nevertheless, the Baptists are like, we don't have anything to do with you, pal. Yeah.
The small town of Girard, Kansas, prepares to say goodbye to a fallen soldier. A helicopter crash in Iraq took the life of Corporal Richard Bennett, just 25 years old. As family and friends gathered to grieve, a small group gathered
can't operate in a vacuum, that faith has to take action.
As a veteran and a pastor, United Methodist Ken Van attends these funerals as often as he can.
Well, they'll line up there.
With their bikes and their bodies, they form a shield between protesters and grieving families. Engines and patriotic music drown out the chanting.
No family should have to face this type of hatred on the day that they're putting their loved one to rest.
Van says even if protesters stop showing up, he and fellow Patriot Guard members will continue to come, stand together as a show of support.
Not only from a patriotic standpoint, but also for the people to know that those in the church care about them, love them, and God is standing with them.
Yeah. What did you think about that? Did you like that? Is that America? How's that America? It's peaceful. And both sides are peaceful. They were peaceful. Yeah, they were peaceful. I mean, peaceful, you could agree with one side more than the other, depending on. Yeah. Yeah, which is kind of irritating because, check this out, and you can make a little note of this because sometimes it's very difficult because, like, and it's really annoying. When I was in college, they would have a variety of different people from a whole wide range of perspectives come and speak on campus. And usually, like, if you disagreed with them, well, then that was a challenge to you to come up with some really witty way of, bouncing off. And they were used to that kind of thing. Unfortunately, what's happened in some campuses, like one group on a campus, a small group will invite a speaker to come in, and then other people are like, oh, we don't want that speaker to be on our campus. So the threat of a violent interaction by people who don't like their message gets the university to cancel the person from being able to speak on campus. They call that write that down. It's called the Heckler's Veto. And it's really, really annoying and an impediment to free speech. The Heckler's Veto. That's where the government says, for example, I mean, if you look back at Skokie, what if the Skokie community was like, no, I'm sorry, we just don't have enough police to handle the massive crowds that are going to come up and beat these Nazis up, so we can't let them protest because for their own security and safety, we have to tell them no because we can't provide protection for them. The so-called Heckler's Veto. It's an interesting thing because who needs to provide the peace for a community during protests? Law enforcement. I was pleased that last summer, by comparison to many communities around the country, Idaho communities got off very well. There were protests, some on both sides, but there really was, there's some angry words a little bit here and there and so forth, but it wasn't like there was, KFCs getting burned down and history museums getting attacked and so forth. So just beware of that. Beware of that because that is a challenge to First Amendment rights, whether it's free speech or freedom of assembly. Okay? Don't try. If you disagree with somebody and so forth, hear them out, walk away, do whatever. But if your first inclination is to take away their constitutional right to get their point of view across, yeah. And don't just be like, because words can hurt, but if you use